I know, down to the cent, how much it costs to cross the river of death. Charon doesn't do discounts. He's a jerk like that. I wasn't buried with money. Not that common these days. Charon understands that, and he's got to make a living like everyone else. So he adapted. He changed it up. He still charges the same amount, but now he takes his tribute in jewelry, fine clothes, and dress shoes. All the accoutrements of luxury that are given to the respected dead. I was buried in a shallow grave by a man I don't remember the name of. He told me, but I've forgotten it over the last century. I do remember that he was crying when he killed me. Regret, maybe. I don't care for his regret. It's got a bitter taste to it. He buried me naked. No bits and baubles to pay for my passage over the river. I was not of the respected dead. I was nobody, and nobody remembered me. When I woke up in the afterlife, I still had the open wounds of his knife, although they didn't hurt or bleed. I spent most of my first days trapped here, huddled into myself, shaking with fear and hiding in denial. There are others, abandoned souls like me. Sometimes, but they always leave quickly. There was the Nigerian woman who died of starvation, stuck in a cave. But a couple days after she arrived, she got smart and traded her beautiful hair for a trip across. My hair is dull and unkempt, not nearly valuable enough. Then a man with eyes the color of sea glass, who tried to swim across by himself. He stepped past the line of silver stakes that kept the souls of the river contained within it, and the damned tore him to shreds instantly. I've got a piece of his arm hidden somewhere. I talk to it sometimes. There must be other rivers, other Charons, because there are never more souls to cross than can fit in the boat. Maybe those other rivers look like the staircase of heaven, or the cycle of reincarnation, and I just got unlucky enough to end up with the only gates to the afterlife that require payment. I don't know if this message is going to go through. Charon gets a day off once every 10 years. In this decade, he went up to the overworld, teleporting there by using the Mickey Mouse watch that he always wears wrapped around his wrist. He spun the little knob once, twice, and then he shimmered into nothing. He brought back a computer for me and set up a Wi-Fi router. It's sitting huddled in the black sand, out of place, surrounded by the wasteland of rocks and dead trees of the underworld. On that same day, he got strings of little pink LEDs and wrapped them around his dock. It's always cast in fading twilight there. The lights shone like a beacon. He told me that he was sorry he couldn't do anything else to help me. He was the ferryman, and he was bound by his nature. I think it might be nice to share my stories, though. It's taken me hours to figure out how all the buttons work. It's strange how quickly technology advances. Charon's certainly advanced with it. He's got a smartphone now. He plays Geometry Dash in the mindless minutes or decades spent waiting for more souls to ferry. There was a chunk of time when he wore things he called Google Glass. "Those make you look ugly," I told him. "You just don't understand fashion," he responded. I tried to steal Charon's boat once upon a time. I waited until he was distracted with something he called a Game Boy. Then I snuck up behind him and struck him in the head with a branch that I'd snapped from one of the shriveled trees that lined the banks. He'd gone down, easy as anything. Immortal, but just as fragile as my skin was when it parted under my murderer's knife. He dropped the oar when I hit him, and it fell into the river, then sunk away into the depths. So I paddled with my hands. I took up the water in my palms and pushed it behind me, while the damned gripped my fingers, trying desperately to pull me in. It was a sacrifice bend. knees pressing indents in the bottom of the boat. My arms splayed out to either side. I pressed prayers into the waters with my bare hands and didn't look away from the shoreline, the shore that would finally take me from this awful limbo. I didn't care where I went after. I was just tired of the endless waiting. But land never drew closer. I put all my strength into it, really buckled down and did the work, but I was just drifting in place, alone and conquered by the river. Charon came to claim his ferry when he woke up. Turned out he had a spare boat. Surprise, surprise. He commanded the boats together and wrapped one big hand around my throat. He held me up over the river while I clawed at his wrist with my fingernails. I should really just drop you in. I choked, because unfortunately the dead can still feel pain. Trying to beg him for mercy with my eyes, I remembered what had happened to the people who tried to swim across, and I was terrified of ending up like them. He sighed, then tossed me in the back like a sack of flour and took me back to shore. It makes sense, in retrospect. He never would have killed me. He gets lonely too. Another time, I tried to steal his watch. He'd learned from the boat incident and was always careful to keep an eye on me when I was around, so I had to wait until his guard was down. I wrapped my fingers around the knob and spun it like I'd seen Charon do, filled with hope for the first time in decades. But nothing happened. I sobbed, and then kept spinning the knob. Charon stood with his hands in his pockets, pity in his eyes. I'm the ferryman. It only works for me. I screamed at him, wordless, and threw the watch into the sand. I gathered stories from the souls passing through, just as a way to pass the time. Fred swirled a small intestine around his finger, thoughtfully, like a piece of hair. He'd been killed by a bear in Yosemite. A freak accident, he said. They were usually so timid. His gut had been torn open by his teeth, and he had to keep a hand pressed over his stomach at all times to keep his organs on the inside. He had worked at a morgue before, and he told me macabre stories of death. Fred decomposed at the bottom of a trench. He had nothing to trade for a trip either. During his third year, he remarked on the silver stakes driven in the banks of the river, the only things binding the damned, then stepped over them and tried to swim the river. When the remnants of his body finally washed up on the shore, they practically crumbled to dust beneath my fingers. Vanessa cracked her head open when she fell down the stairs in her house. I can see her brain tissue because of the caved-in dent on the back of her head. She had a necklace that she had been buried with, but she didn't want to get on that boat, and Charon didn't force her. She sat beside me for days and mumbled to herself. "You should get on the boat, Vanessa," I said to her. She didn't respond, but when I guided her towards the dock, she didn't resist. Charon pulled the necklace from her unresisting fingers, stuck it into his money pouch, and got her settled on one of the benches. As he pushed off from the dock with his paddle, she turned to me, her eyes suddenly clear. "Everything is already dead here. Everything except the bugs who stick their heads out of the ground. I hear them when they run under my fingers and burrow under my nails," she told me. I just smiled and nodded. Vanessa seemed to like it when I smiled. We got an earthquake a couple weeks after Vanessa left. They sometimes happened. I had no idea why, and if Charon knew, he wasn't telling. He was trying to pull his boat out of the wild waves of the river before it got bashed against the dock, and only somewhat succeeding. Despite most of my attention being occupied by laughing at him, my eyes were drawn to something shifting down the river. I took a moment to process what I was seeing, and then I was screaming for Charon. A crack was forming in the ground, running along the bank and separating out a piece of land from the rest. It looked like the river was taking a handful of ground and pulling it into the water. "The stakes," Charon whispered, suddenly right beside me. With a jolt of fear, I realized he was right. There was a glint of silver just above the waterline as the stakes fell into the river along with the ground they were attached to. The stakes fell into the river with a sound like a fire starting. There was a pause, a moment of calm, and then the damned, constantly testing the edges of their prison, found the crack in the wall. They swarmed up onto the bank, dripping wet, and climbing over each other in their eagerness to get to me and Charon. "Run!" he yelled, pushing me behind him. He twisted the knob of his watch half a turn and raised his hands in front of him. The air glimmered with red, and then the advancing wave of the damned hit an invisible wall. They screamed as one, raking their claws along the barrier. Charon was sweating in seconds, his hands trembling. I ran for the dock, where I knew Charon kept emergency stakes. I fell to my knees in the sand beside his tool chest and gathered up a handful, as well as a hammer. When I got to my feet, I could see that his shield was failing. A claw slipped through, or the end of a tail. A damned managed to fit its entire upper body through the barrier before Charon managed to push it back. We didn't have much time. He saw me coming, the silver in my hand, and nodded in grim understanding. He turned the knob another degree and took a step forward, pushing the shield and the damned with him. I stayed beside him, holding onto his arm when he stumbled. I tried not to look at the damned. I was barely holding on to my courage, without the sight of them literally foaming at the mouth as they tried to get to me. We reached the bank. The damned were being pushed back into the water, howling all the way. I gripped a stake and drove it against the hard rock above the water, using all my strength to hammer it in. One of the damned got through the shield, swiping out from me with its claws. I flinched back, dodging most of it, but it still managed to score a line across my thigh. It leapt for me, and I swung the hammer against its skull, hitting it out of the air. It landed hard and kept twitching, trying to get back up. I stepped over it, moving awkwardly from the cut I had in my leg, and smashed it to pieces until it stopped being able to move. It was still conscious, technically. I couldn't kill something that was already dead, but its body was so torn to pieces that it couldn't make its limbs move. "That was for Fred," I told its shattered remains. "Hurry up," Charon said through gritted teeth. He had fallen to his knees at some point, and the barrier was sputtering. I moved to the next spot, drove a stake in, then the next. The stakes couldn't be more than 3 meters apart. They had originally been spaced at exactly that distance, but I didn't have time to be more exact, and just hoped that they were close enough. With one stake left, Charon's barrier fell, and he slumped to the ground. 2 damned climbed back out of the river before I could get the stake in place. I was holding silver and had bits of their defeated companion in my hair, so they ignored me completely and went for the easier prey, Charon. He could barely keep his eyes open, but he made a slicing motion with 2 fingers, laboriously slow, and then one of the damned collapsed with its head separated from its body. The other damned, running inhumanly fast, blurred right over the viscera now staining the sand and tore Charon's throat open with its claws. If that had happened to me, I would probably have been fine. It would have hurt like hell, but I would still exist. I didn't need my blood, or even my skin. It was just a container to house my soul. Charon wasn't like me. He was the ferryman, sure, but he also went back above ground once a decade on his holiday, and was technically still a living mortal himself. He could be permanently hurt, and he could die At least it was quick. He probably didn't suffer. The damned sunk its teeth into his chest, shaking him like a dog with a favorite toy. I limped towards it, tears in my eyes and my hammer thumping against my leg with every step. The damned eyed me and my hammer apprehensively, huddling over Sharon's body with its teeth still stuck in him. Sharon's wrist splayed out on the sand behind the damned, starting to glow. Squinting, I could see that the light was coming from the watch. On instinct, I held up my hand, and the watch quivered in place, then flew past the damned, straight to me. It thumped against my forehead, leaving a welt, and fell into my hand. The damned growled at me, dragging Charon's body with it as it went back. I strapped on the watch, and there was a burst of light, a sense of warmth. This time, when I turned the knob, the results were explosive. The dam burst into flames, and its squealing and helpless squirms did nothing but entice the fire faster. After, when Charon's corpse had been covered, until I figured out what to do with him, and I had double and triple checked that the stakes would hold, I realized something. The ferryman was dead. I had the watch. There was nothing stopping me from rowing across the river, or even teleporting to the surface and trying to find my way back into the living. I started a fire while I thought about it, using the branches of the dead trees, and lighting it with the last smoldering ashes of the damned that had killed Charon. By the time the fire had burned down, I had my answer. I gathered Charon's body in my arms and turned the knob. I hadn't seen the sun in so long. It was as beautiful as I remembered. It took a little bit of tinkering, but eventually I figured out the controls of the watch. I laid my hand over Charon's eyes, and he crumbled into dust. The dust was blown away in the wind. Then I went back to the underworld. The ferryman was dead. I had the watch. Charon was bound by tradition, by the stories that held him rigidly in place as the stern purveyor of who only allowed paying customers. People expected him to ask for payment, and belief is a powerful thing in the underworld. But I was completely unimportant, a true nobody. There was nothing stopping me from taking anyone across the river who wanted to go. I could make sure that no one that came to my afterlife was ever left alone on the banks again.